We're in chapter 15 of Mark today, and this is a unique chapter because it's one that we would typically read around the time of Easter, because we're going to enter into Jesus being presented before Pilate, all the torture he endured, and then ultimately his crucifixion. But the chapter ends with his crucifixion, not with the resurrection. That's not until chapter 16. So chapter 15, in the entire scope of the gospel, is actually a pretty somber chapter. A lot of the times, you read it at Easter and you read through the details of the torture and you break down like, oh, what did that look like? And, I've seen pastors come up with mathematical equations to like, how many lashes did he get and how much blood did he lose? And like what medical, I watched a YouTube video about like a medical practitioner walking through the Passion. And they talk about like the degree of damage in which Jesus' body incurred, which is all impactful for us. But I want us to read 15 today through a different lens. And I want us to read it through the lens of whether or not we have truly considered the cost of following Jesus. And some of that looks physical, but I want to focus on the internal. So before we get started, like typical, I want to give a little historical background. I just love reading about the history and everything as we look into the Bible. And so understanding that as we look at this point where Jesus is being crucified, the tensions between Romans and Jews really couldn't have been much worse. Romans had the military might and power. They were the police of the day, but the Sanhedrin and the High Council ultimately had all the cultural influence and had a lot of wealth to back them up as well. So as much as the Jews didn't want the Romans and the Romans didn't want the Jews, they kind of gave this tit-for-tat relationship, like I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, but it was completely out of obligation. There was no love between them. Even as much as, Pontius Pilate benefited. He even utilized money from the temple to build an aqueduct at some point, but Jews in the city found out about that and rebelled. There were multiple uprisings under Pontius Pilate, and he was having to quell these rebellions and beat people and imprison people. And so he was seen as this kind of heavy-handed overlord to the Jews, obviously. And Pontius himself, we read him in the Bible and we see him as obviously he's the one that turns Jesus over to be crucified. And, we have this, even the Catholics, I think, or maybe, I know the Ethiopian church, they revere Pontius because of his hesitancy to crucify Christ. And they believe that Pontius is actually a saint and he ultimately converted to Christianity later in life. I don't know if that's true, but it's odd to see a Roman governor be so submissive to the Jewish people. And when we read into him discussing with the Sadducees and the Pharisees, it's very odd to see, for somebody who's supposed to be the ruling power of the day, he was awfully submissive to a group of people who didn't have nearly as much military might. So let us read in Mark 15, 1 through 8. It says, very early in the morning, the leading priests, the elders, and the teachers of the religious law, they enter the high council, met to discuss their next step. They bound Jesus, led him away, and took him to Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And he replied, you have said it. Then the leading priests kept accusing him of many crimes, and Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer them? What about all these charges they are bringing against you? But Jesus said nothing, much to Pilate's surprise. So as much as the Romans were theoretically corrupt at this time and overbearing, the Jewish leaders were just as corrupt, more or less. They were extremely religious. Like they did all the things they were supposed to do according to the law, but they did it in a very legalistic manner. There's a clip from The Chosen, which is really good. It's Jesus talking to the Pharisees, and he's saying, like, you don't care about these people, you don't care about the poor. And the Pharisee, he rebuts back and he says, what are you talking about? I tithe from my very garden food from the poor. And Jesus is like, are you kidding me? You give like dill and mint and cilantro? He's like, these are the things you give to the poor? He's like, you swallow a camel for yourself, but then you wring out a gnat for the poor. And what Jesus is saying is like, yeah, you sure do. You follow the letter of the law, but you do it out of religious obligation, not out of a heart overflowing with generosity to give. So they bring him up in front of Pilate, And verse 6, it says, "Now it was the governor's custom each year during Passover celebration to release one prisoner, anyone the people requested. One of the prisoners at that time was Barabbas, a revolutionary who had committed murder in an uprising. The crowd went to Pilate and asked him to release a prisoner as usual." Again, historically, this is really strange. Pilate, the governor of Israel, who is a part of the greatest empire on earth at this point, is allowing prisoners to be released on a religious holiday that he does not recognize nor celebrate. Why would he do that? It's 100% because he realizes that there is this imbalance of power in Israel. And in order to keep the Jews from rebelling, in order to keep them pacified, he's come up with this idea of like, okay, every year during Passover, we'll release a prisoner. And so he asks, okay, well, do you want me to release Jesus to you? And they're like, no, we want Barabbas. Barabbas was a political revolutionary who was in jail for murder. And so seeing as he's a political revolutionary in jail for murder, it means he either killed a Roman politician, a Roman soldier, which is probably unlikely because if he would have done that, he probably would have been dead already. What's very likely is that Barabbas, and this is me completely, I'm just using context clues here. This is just the English teacher in me. I do not have evidence to back this up. My English teacher brain and my context clues brain makes me think that Barabbas more than likely is in jail for murdering a tax collector, one of their own. If he would have murdered a Roman citizen, he probably would have been killed already. So if he's in jail for murder, it's more than likely he killed a Jew who was working for the Romans. It's funny that the Jews want Jesus condemned, but they want to release Barabbas because Barabbas fits much closer to the idea of the Messiah that they're hoping for than Jesus does. Now, they did not think Barabbas was the Messiah, not even close, but they did see him as more of a benefit to them than Jesus. Barabbas was out killing people who opposed the Jewish people, right? He's killing tax collectors. He's rising up. He wants to overthrow Rome the same way the Jews believe the Messiah should be. The Messiah should come to overthrow this dictatorship that they're under. So Barabbas is actually like a shining hero in the eyes of the high council, whereas Jesus, who's come to upset all of their earthly power, is a massive problem for them. So verse 9 says, "Would you like me to release to you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked, for he realized now that the leading priests had arrested Jesus out of envy. But at this point, the leading priests stirred up the crowd to demand the release of Barabbas instead of Jesus. Pilate asked them, "Then what should I do with the man you call king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why?" Pilate asked. "What crime has he committed?" But the mob roared even louder, "Crucify him." So to pacify the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He ordered Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip, then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. So they call for Jesus to be crucified. I want you to take a moment and think back to like years ago when you read Leviticus and Deuteronomy and you know all those weird laws, like if you find a dead body in the middle of the desert, I want you to like walk like this and figure out like what town's the closest and that town has to pay for the body. Or like if you cut off somebody's arm, like you have to owe them this many donkeys and chickens and stuff like that. Think back to all of those weird rules and think back to how many of them the consequence was to be crucified. 0. Because crucifixion was actually completely against Jewish law, because Jewish law forbade any sort, even in the sense of like, you're guilty of murder, you need to be killed. The Jewish law forbade any sort of action that would cause torture to the person in order to be put to death. Most of the Jewish methods of putting people to death theoretically should have been quick. So this idea of crucifixion is purely a Roman one. So for a body of leaders, like the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the high council, for them to demand Jesus, a Jew, to be condemned to die via means of crucifixion shows the bitterness, the anger, the envy they have for him, the pettiness. They are commanding that this dictatorship that they're under, they don't want to benefit from the empire, or they don't want anything to do with the empire unless it benefits them. So in this moment, they know they can call upon crucifixion because it's something that the Romans actively did for a sign of fear. So the Jews who are apparently so strict at following their own laws and following the Torah and following the feasts and giving money in the temple and tithing to the poor, the ones who are so concerned with maintaining this law immediately step out of it in order to cause somebody pain and torture that they don't like because they're upsetting their values. And so, we look at verse 16. It says, the soldiers took Jesus into the courtyard of the governor's headquarters, called the Praetorium, and called out the entire regiment. They dressed him in purple robe, and they wove thorn branches into a crown and put it on his head. They saluted him and taunted him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him on the head with a reed stick. They spit on him. They dropped to their knees in mock worship. And when they were finally tired of mocking him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes back on him again, and they led him away to be crucified. I want us to look and focus on this. And if you've ever seen Passion of the Christ, I mean, it's like, well, I'm an emotional person, so maybe it's just me. It's hard to get through without crying, obviously, like just seeing somebody suffer in that way. And I think that's something that we typically cling to, is this like idea of physical torture that Jesus endured. And there's something about, even in our culture, there's something about enduring suffering that like is honorable to some degree. Let me give you a couple illustrations so you understand. There is a James Bond movie with Daniel Craig. I don't remember which one it is. I don't know, something Die Another or something, or Wake Up Tomorrow Dead or something, whatever. All those weird ones. And he's strapped to a chair, and he's being tortured by this guy, right? And so the guy like hits him with this like rope with a ball on the end, and he's like, "What do you have to say now, James Bond?" And he's like, "A little more to the left, I have an itch." And you're like, yeah, tell him. And you look at that and you're like, yeah, like he's enduring this suffering. It's like a proud thing to do, right? I had a friend in high school whose family were in ministry, and they often like traveled overseas and did mission work and would come back. And they had like a handful of kids, somewhere between like 45 and 80 or something like that. And so because they had so many kids, realistically, I think they had 9 or something like that. And so they all, like obviously they weren't poor, but they didn't enjoy certain luxuries that others would. Like all of their cars were very old. They like tried to fix them as much as they could. They didn't go on big vacations, you know. You're not going to eat out like with a family like that. Like they had big old pots of rice or chili or whatever. And so they lived fine and comfortably, but they didn't enjoy certain luxuries. So one of the girls who was in my age and in our friend group, she had to go to the dentist to have her wisdom teeth removed. So she goes and they give her the bill of like how much it'll cost to do the procedure. And she's looking at it. She's like, "Oh, dang, this is a lot of money." She's like, "Wait, I see here like Novocaine and like the laughing gas and stuff. Like that's a lot of extra money. Can I just not get that?" And they're like, "You're going to want that." And she's like, "No, I'm just going to do it." And the dentist is like, "Okay." So sure enough, she goes to the dentist and has all 4 of her wisdom teeth yanked out of her head with 0 painkillers. 0. And we saw her, I don't know if it was the same day or maybe the next day, and you know, her cheeks are, she looks like a chickmunk. You know, she's got gauze in her mouth and everything. We're like, "Are you okay?" She's like, "I mean, it was bad, but like, I'm alive." And you know, you just look at her and you're like, "You're so sick. Like, you're so sick. That's incredible." And we celebrate that. And we look at her and we're like, "Yeah, girl, you get it, girl. You get those teeth yanked out of your head with no painkillers." I, on the other hand, just went to the dentist and they told me I needed to have my wisdom teeth removed. And I was like, "I need everything you have. Like, jab me up, please." They're like, are you bad with like blood and stuff?" And I was like, "I passed out the last time I donated blood. So yeah, I'm probably going to need some Novocaine." But one last illustration, just because it came to my head and it's super funny. I saw this video on Instagram of this guy. He's fishing offshore, and they must be on the Atlantic because they're catching shark, you know, like shark about this big. And the dad has him on the line, and he goes to grab the shark by the gills to pull him into the boat. And when he does, the shark flinches and grabs his pinky. And the shark starts spinning around and twisting, and it yanks his pinky straight off of his hand. And the dad goes, "Darn it, he got my pinky," as if he had just dropped his keys in the water. Like the kids, the mom are screaming their heads off, and dad's just like, forgot to change the oil in the car again. And you look at him and you're like, "Are you out of your mind? Like, you've lost an appendage. They don't grow back." And he's just like, "Whatever, tape it up. I see some red snapper over there. We need to go get him." Like, there's something about enduring physical pain that we celebrate in our culture to some degree. I mean, there's something proud about like enduring pain and suffering, right? Sometimes we even tell people like, "Oh yeah, I got bit by a snake," you know, or like, you know, I cut my arm cutting firewood. It's like we brag about it. And we can look at Jesus and say, like, yeah, look at what my king endured. Like, look at what my God can do. Yeah, he is willing to endure that pain for me. It's much different when it comes to, like, emotional pain. It's much easier to endure physical pain to, like, our temporary shells. It's much more difficult to endure pain that hits directly at our soul and at our being. Like, if you went to the dentist and rather than having to endure physical pain, they're like, hey, what are your greatest insecurities? Because we're going to surround you before your surgery and just kind of like talk about those and make fun of you and tell you how ugly we think you are and stuff like that. Do you mind doing that? Can you just list your insecurities? You'd be like, absolutely not. I don't want that. We don't want to be like made physical. Like, physical uncomfort is a thing we can deal with. Emotional uncomfortability is something that we are staunchly opposed to. Because, again, physical pain, like, it lasts for a little bit. Emotional pain is something that can last for generations. And we don't want to endure emotional pain and things that are going to make us uncomfortable because it's inconvenient for us. Going to the dentist to get my teeth worked on, I'm like, okay, you're going to have me in and out of here in an hour. Like, I'll put up with it. The thing with emotional pain, or the thing with having to change who we are, or having to face hard facts about who we are, the decisions we've made, and have repercussions for those things, that's hard. Realizing we've been living a lifestyle or making decisions that are having a negative effect on our walk with God, that's difficult to face. There's shame tied up in that. There's conviction. There's guilt. But unfortunately, that's the exact kind of thing that Jesus is asking us to do. When Jesus in Luke asks us to consider the cost of following me, though he was probably discussing the idea of like, yeah, you might be tortured and have things thrown at you and stuff like that, we don't have that struggle today. We have the privilege of wearing cross t-shirts and cross necklaces and expressing outwardly that we are Christians without any fear of being persecuted. You might get made fun of. That's not persecution. Like, I get made fun of because I like to dress up and go to Renfest. That's not persecution. That's just people having differing opinions. But we're not persecuted like other people are in the world. I had a student named Merritt. She was from Egypt, and I remember going to her desk one day to help her, and as I leaned over her desk, I noticed she had a tattoo on her wrist right here, and it was a cross, and it was very primitive, like it wasn't fancy at all, literally just like, it looked like somebody went, eh, eh. And I asked her, I was like, Merritt, aren't you like 15? Like, why do you have a tattoo? She's like, in Egypt, when you're born, because she was a Christian, she's like, when you're a Christian in Egypt, they will tattoo you as a child so that they know that you are a Christian. That's not so they can like hand out prizes to you randomly. There's a reason that a government would want to track who is and who isn't a Christian by tattooing their wrist in a way that's like open to see. Bree's parents actually have some neighbors who live next door to them who are Egyptian, and they're practicing Muslims, extremely kind people. Half of Hezekiah's clothes are from them. I mean, they're extremely generous. And I spoke to him, and I asked him, I was like, man, help me understand, like, what is Egypt like? Because apparently Egypt, of all the Middle Eastern countries, and especially in Cairo, has one of the most balanced populations as far as, like, most other Middle Eastern countries are, like, 90+% Muslim, whereas Egypt and Cairo has a more balanced percentage of, like, Christians and Jews there. So I asked him, I was like, what is it like living in Egypt? And he goes, honestly, Mitchell, like my friends, we had Christians in our home. We had Jews in our home. We had Muslims in our home. Like, we as people love one another. It's our governments who end up causing all of the strife and hatred between each other. It is the government who dictates, like, oh, you're going to be tattooed at birth. There's people in here, I have tattoos on both of my legs that identify me as a Christian. And I'm not afraid to show that, and nobody forced me to get that. That is our privilege that we have in the West to be able to say, yeah, I'm a Christian and I'm proud of it. We don't have any sort of animosity towards walking out of this building and going to the waiter at lunch and being like, hey, I'm a Christian, I just came from church. Now, they might look at you like, oh, do you want sweet tea or not? Like, what do you... Like, they might look at you kind of funny, like it might be a little awkward, but they're not going to go in the back and tell somebody to follow you home and kill you because of your beliefs. So we have this privilege to be able outwardly to express this commitment that we have to God. But the hard work comes when you allow God to come in and change what's going on the inside. You know, you can read your Bible, you can pray, you can tithe, you can come to church every Sunday, and you're technically ticking all the boxes, but that doesn't make you any closer to God. That makes you religious. That makes you pharisaical. They were perfect in the way they practiced their law. They were the best tithers. They were praying all the time in the synagogue. They made the best sacrifices. They committed a lot of their money to the church. They knew the scriptures. They memorized the scriptures. They were religious, and they were perfectly good at it. Jesus called them whitewashed tombs. You're perfect on the outside and completely dead on the inside. Coming to church, tithing, praying, and reading your Bible does not make you any closer to God. These are just outward things that we do. And I've had this discussion with people, and I've heard people argue against this whole like, oh, you want me to read my Bible this long a day, or like you want me to pray for this amount of time, or you want me to give money to church. Like, that's just religion, man. That's legalistic. Like, you're judgmental. You just want me to do these things to fall in line. And so then they go off the other end, which is this like, I can't remember the technical term. It's like antinomianism, which is like the whole, I'm post-resurrection. I'm not Old Testament. God died for me and he's going to forgive me. I can do whatever I want and I will be forgiven. I'm like, true. Yes, true. And I think the problem with those two things is that we see salvation as like the stopping point for our walk with God. So you're like, well, I've accepted Christ. I'm done. And I would argue, no, salvation is vastly important to your life. Vastly important. It is what makes us who we are as Christians. It is accepting Christ as Lord of our life. But if you accept him and then you hop off the bus, you're not going to go anywhere. So you'll live in this cognitive dissonance of thinking, I'm doing all of these things that I'm supposed to be doing. Why am I still struggling with all of these things I'm still struggling with? Why is there no growth in my life? It's because all of these outward things, unless they're allowed to change you inwardly, mean absolutely nothing. Nothing. You could tell me that, and I've done this before. I remember when I used to tell myself, I'm going to read a chapter in the Old Testament, a chapter in the New Testament, and a psalm every single day. And so I woke up at like 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. I, like a little pretentious little man that I was, lit a candle, sat next to it, and just read my Bible by candlelight in the morning. You know what it did for me? It made me more tired because I got up early, and it made me frustrated because I wanted to go back to bed. And so what did I do? I speed read through both chapters. I picked the short psalm, and I went about my day. And I'm going, God, I'm reading my Bible more. Why aren't I changing? As a matter of fact, I kind of feel worse. It's because these religious actions do nothing for your soul. It's the same reason we see Christians get in arguments over alcohol. It's like, well, Jesus didn't turn water into wine. He turned it into grape juice. Jesus doesn't drink. It says, do not become drunk with wine. Jesus doesn't drink. So I'm not going to drink, and you shouldn't either, and I'm judging you if you do. Opposite side of the spectrum. Well, I'm not drunk. It was only a couple. Jesus turned water into wine. So, we use all these justifications either way. And I'm not saying either one's right or wrong. Like, go with your conviction. But the point of the matter is not to sit there and argue with somebody of whether or not you should drink. Ask yourself, why did God command us not become drunk? It's not about the drunkenness. It's about what that leads to and what it's doing inside of your soul. It's the reliance on the substance to solve your problems rather than Jesus to solve your problems. It has nothing to do with whether or not you're a good person or a bad person because you drink or don't drink. You've missed the point. It's not about reading your Bible, tithing, and praying. It's about reading your Bible to understand who God is, praying so that you align your heart with what he's asking you to do, tithing out of generosity because you trust him, and then being in community with people here to hold you accountable and to lift you up rather than allowing yourself to be isolated and listening to the voices in your head. Because you're either going to be conformed or transformed to this world. You will either be conformed or transformed. There is nothing in between. This whole accepting Christ and then sitting on the side of the road waiting for something to happen, it is not a passive thing. That's the thing. Everything you do, you're either conforming to the ways of the world or you're being transformed by Jesus. And that is the tension you will live in forever. And that's the other thing. Don't get it twisted. Like, don't think, oh, well, like this person's better than me, or like somebody's saying like, well, I'm better than you because I do read my Bible every day and I pray more than you. No. They're on the walk too. They're just further down the road. Or maybe they took a shortcut and came back. It's not about like levels of like good, better, best. It's the active participation in the sanctification of being more like Christ. Because if we're going to say that, if you're going to look at me and you're going to say, okay, all of us sitting in here, you're Christians. I'm assuming there's probably some of you not. That's fine. Don't raise your hand. I'll get to you. If we are sitting here and saying, I've accepted Jesus as Lord of my life because I believe what he said is true, that his commandments are good, and I want to be more like him, then why aren't we? If it's true, then why aren't we pursuing it? And this is not a shame, condemnation thing. This is me in the mirror. I have the same conversations with myself. Paul had the same conversations with himself. Why do I do the things I do not want to do, but I don't do the things that I want to do? Because we live in this shell that is ultimately run by a flesh factory that wants pleasure and comfort. And what God is saying is, yeah, you're going to have to rip that off. You're going to have to throw those weights off in order to run this race and to run it well. And my fear is that when we look at the Bible and we look at prayer and we look at community at church and we think about doing these things, rather than seeing them as something that's going to transform our life, we look at God and we say, it's just a little too inconvenient for me. That's religion. That's bondage. You know the difference between bondage and commitment? It's perspective. You go to your doctor and you say, you have a heart condition, you need to lose weight, or you're going to die. And you go, now I have to give up all this good stuff. I can't have Oreos anymore. I can't have Taco Bell. Like, I can't eat queso directly from the cup. I have to wake up at 5 a.m. Yeah, I run the time I'm supposed to run. I lift weights. I do the things he's telling me to do. But then I go back home and I was good. So I'll have a Big Mac and fries and a Coke. It's fine. I did what I was supposed to do. I'm doing the things he asked me to do. You will not get any better. Continuing to live the lifestyle you live and go to the gym out of obligation, you're going to be fighting this tensionous battle between why am I exhausted from going to the gym, but why am I not seeing any results? It's because you're trying to live in the world and you're trying to be like Jesus at the same time, and that's impossible. If you can shift your perspective to go, oh, this isn't an obligation, this isn't bondage, he's trying to save my life. The doctor's telling me to do these things because he wants me to live longer and enjoy life and have it abundantly. He's not doing this because he's I want to control every aspect of your day. Your doctor gives zero craps about what you do with your day, honestly. I remember telling my kids at school, I was hey, if you want to get, they're I'm not good at reading. I struggle reading. I'm okay, what you need to do is you need to start reading more every day. Read a little bit more every day. Well, I don't like to, it's hard. It's going to stay that way unless you try to do something about it. You have to do something. Expecting sanctification and spiritual formation to fall in your lap, you're going to be disappointed forever. Forever. But the good news is this isn't condemnation. This is something that Jesus has told us. I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to help you through it. The first switch you need to make is realizing that nothing is more valuable than following Christ. Nothing. Nothing will change your life like following Christ. Nothing will bring you pleasure or joy like following Christ. And if there's something in your life that you feel is more important, you've bought into a lie. That's all it is. And we've all done it. This is not a me looking at you thing. We have all done that. And whether it's from trauma, whether it's from being exhausted, whatever it is, we've all clung to things that bring us earthly pleasure and satisfaction because it's hard to be like Jesus. And it is a long road to haul. But that doesn't mean we don't do anything. I think that we have the convenience of the West in being Peters. When it comes to like in a group, we'll be the loudest one to talk out. We'll be like, that's right, we're Christians. The world looks at America and knows like we say the Pledge of Allegiance in school. I'm sorry, the Pledge of Allegiance. We say, we do prayer in school. We say the Pledge of Allegiance and we say God. Christmas time, you best believe it. I'm telling people, Merry Christmas. What are you going to do about it? We'll cut people's ears off, like Peter did. But then when it comes to when the rubber meets the road and somebody goes, hey, aren't you Peter? Didn't you like hang out with that Jesus guy? Oh, no, that ain't me. No. No, don't make me uncomfortable. Don't put me in a position to where my comfort, my way of life might be at risk. Don't ask me to step out of something I'm not willing to do. I already do all those other things, Mitch. I already read the Bible. I already pray. I tithe. I come to church. You see me every Sunday. Okay. Is that it? Is that satisfying you? Do you feel that cognitive dissonance of like, why do I keep doing the same things I've been doing over and over again? My fear is that we would be like Peter. The outward expressions of our faith would be the boldest proclamations and the boldest moves we make. We'll wear the necklaces, we'll say Merry Christmas, we'll post things on Instagram. But when it comes to that quiet place, when you're alone with God, and you feel that voice talking to you, you feel that conviction fall on you, you shake it off, and you're like, no, not that. I don't want to give that up. I don't want to start doing that. Leave me to my comfort, and I'll tithe. Leave me to my comfort, and I might read my Bible a little bit more. Lead me to my comfort, and I'll show up for church every Sunday. It's not for him. It's for you. He's not like, he doesn't have a list of like, oh, Mitch didn't do his quiet time today, big X. It's not for him. The doctor is not calling you every day, hey, did you go to the gym? Did you or did you not? I don't know if you guys have ever seen My 600-Pound Life. It's super sad, for one thing. But like, the doctor tells her like, okay, you need to be on like 800 calories a day. And she's 600 plus pounds. And she shows up a month later and she's gained 10 pounds. And she's like, well, I'm eating all good things. He goes, you're clearly lying to me. Like, I can see you've gained 10 pounds. Like, calories in, calories out. Like, there's not a whole lot of like wiggle room here. She's like, well, it's water weight. And he's like, what? She's like, well, yeah, it's humid in here, so you retain more, or whatever. You come up with all these excuses of like why you're not seeing progress. And it's like, again, with that situation, you can't hide the inward. You can't hide the inward there. Here, you can hide the inward. You can be like, yep, I'm like, you guys see me. I'm here every Sunday. Things are doing well. You guys see me. I'm carrying my Bible. You see this? Carrying my Bible. I even roughed it up to make it look like I open it more often. Somebody texts you, hey, what are you doing? Oh, I'm just praying. Sorry, I didn't text you back. I was praying. You're going to McAllister's after this, and you're like, dear Heavenly Father, bless this baked potato and this sour cream and cheese to my body. Bring me nourishment, Lord. You guys see me praying over this right now? It's easy to hide all that stuff. It's when you go home and you're like looking at porn, getting drunk, and telling yourself that, hey, Jesus turned water into wine. I'm not drunk yet. I've only had 5. Texting people online, well, she's just a work friend. These are all just those common things we typically cite. You know what it is for you. You know that thing that Jesus is asking you to throw off, this weight you're asking to give up. And again, this isn't shame and conviction. What it is, I want you to address that cognitive dissonance you feel, is that you're doing all the things. Just like the Pharisees did. You're doing all the things. Then why is Jesus telling me to my face that I'm a whitewashed tomb? One of my biggest fears is getting to heaven and being like, Jesus, I'm so glad I'm here. And he goes, away from me, like I never knew you, man. And I'm like, do you want to be that person in heaven that Jesus is like, who's that? You're like, you spent all your time doing the things, checking the boxes, but you didn't allow me to change you. You didn't allow me to change your heart. Do you want to be more like me? Do you not believe that I can change you? Do you not believe the things that I'm offering you are ultimately going to save your life? Because, man, you're clinging real hard to that 401k. Man, you're clinging real hard to that relationship you need to be given up. You're clinging real hard to whatever it is you're clinging to.